Hi everyone. Welcome to the Reflectors webinar. We are hosting a webinar at an unusual time today because we have a guest speaker from South Korea. Let me introduce today's speakers, Dr. Youngryel Ryu and Kanishka Mallick. The first speaker, Youngryel Ryu, is a full professor at Seoul National University in South Korea, an editorial board member of Global Change Biology, and an associate editor of Remote Sensing of the Environment. He and his group use a variety of tools across a wide range of scales, including flux measurement, remote sensing techniques, and models to understand ecological functions. And he published a lot of papers, about 100 papers since the late 20s. And among his works, he must be well known to the flux community for developing the Breathing Earth System Simulator, BESS, that quantifies global GPP and evapotranspiration. And the second speaker, Kanishka Mallick, is a lead research and teaching associate at Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, LIST, and is currently visiting UC Berkeley as a research fellow. He's also a PI of the project European Ecostress Hub, funded by European Space Agency, and a science team member of the Indo-French Trishna mission. And his evapotranspiration model is officially used for ecostress and also will be used for future Trishna missions. His research interests include advancing the application of thermal remote sensing to understand large-scale evaporation variability, evaporation model development, understanding biophysical controls on evaporation components, and how to use multiple spectral signatures from remote sensing in synergy to understand ecosystem water stress. Okay, so Youngryel, if you're ready, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Hey. Oh. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Kuhn, for a nice introduction. So it is fairly early time in the morning of Seoul. It is, how to do that? It is now 8 a.m. So today I will give a very brief talk about how to upscale of the land surface fluxes using the hyper resolution of remote sensing in space, time, and spectrum. Okay. Yeah, so all the results that I will present today is the good work, not my own work. I found that the first lecture was made by Steve Roney, I think already in this year, of this omniflux sensing of year some program. And I found the title was, in the beginning, there was FluxNet and MODIS. And I learned many things from Dennis about their nice collaborations between the FluxNet community and the MODIS team to validate the MODIS product. And only in these years, they already developed how to upscale the land surface fluxes from the plot observations to the landscape scales. And at the time, there was a Bigfoot project that was early 2000s. It was made for validation of MODIS products, and it combined the length and MODIS. So as you can see here, there is a flux towers, and people collect the data set in the field, and here is a Landsat, here is MODIS. So they try to aggregate, scale up from the small pixels to the large pixels. But at the time, the most common practice for the validation of MODIS product was we extracted a 3x3 MODIS pixel centered on the tower. So that is always 3x3 kilometer was the key, the normal target of validation of the MODIS. But as you know, the flux footprint is much smaller than that. And so now with the new satellite missions, there are lots of satellites in the space. So there are the opportunities are emerging. So first is the low Earth orbit. That is the image of the low Earth orbit around 400 kilometers. There are lots of debris, and of course, also there are quite many active sensors. So low Earth orbit is very busy, lots of satellites, and of course there are the CubeSat constellations from like Planet, and there are quite many companies now. and also a lot of cameras from that low Earth orbit, but the camera quality is usually low and also has very limited spectral bands like RGB and infrared. And I think one opportunity emerged from this simple index, that is a near NIRV proposed, developed by Grayson and Joe and Chris Field. And this simple index turns out that is very, very useful to track the photosynthesis of the canopy. But when they first developed, their data was half degree, around 50 kilometers. And then last year, Ben Duchamp in my group, so he published a paper about NIVP, that is NIV multiplied by the PAR. So because NIV does not include the radiation information, so we just multiply PAR, and it predicted GBP pretty well across space and time, and sometimes it even performed better than SIF in predicting GBP. And so then I think that is where we can meet with the CubeSat, because the NIVP means that it only requires the red and infrared, just 2 bands. And that is most abundant in the low Earth orbit satellites. And yeah, for example, Planiscope, they provide 3 meter daily globally. Now I think they provide like 1.5 meter globally. And also the P is PAR incoming radiation is quite abundant in very diverse data sets. So for NIVP, so we can apply the low Earth orbit satellites to just use NIVP to predict GBP. So that was the motivation of several papers, recent papers in my group. So first paper was made by Chuan. He was recently he got a PhD from our group, and he joined the Kanishka group 2 weeks later. So here the key motivation was that. So here is the flux towers in the California Delta, Sacramento, the Delta site, where the Dennis has multiple flux towers. As you can see, the flux tower footprint, it varies space and time. And what we did here is that we computed NIV. First is we calculated the NIV from the inside to spectral sensors, because Dennis has the 2-band spectrometers in all the flux tower sites. So we just use the infrared and red spectral reflectance, and the infrared reflectors multiplied by the NDVI, then incoming daily PAR. And here y-axis is daily GBP. And you can see that the relationship was quite divergent. But once we isolated the pixels of the NIFV using the planar fusion, that is 3 meter, so we isolated pixels within the flux tower footprint, and they multiply by PAR, and then their relationship with tower GPP was very consistent. So that indicates that in the old days, we just used the 3x3 modest pixels centered on the flux tower, but now it is doable to extract the pixels within the tower, and in these ways, we can compare apple to apple. And so now there are quite many towers have the spectral sensors in the tower, but their spectral footprint is much smaller than flux tower footprint. So 3x3 pixels centered on the flux tower approach does not match with flux tower footprint. And now, because due to the high spatial and temporal resolution satellite images, it is now doable to isolate the pixels within the flux tower footprint. I think that is quite a useful way to upscale of the field observations to the landscape scale. And then, because most of the CubeSat has very short the time records, like last 5 years, but most of the FluxNet data set has 10 and 20 years. For example, Dennis has the 100 viral range is from around early 2000s, and Harvard Forest is 1992. And so to apply such approach into the long period back, so we developed the Superresorption approach. So we generated 3-meter Landsat by developing the double GAN model that is tuned with planar fusion with Landsat, and we applied the model into the whole historical Landsat data set. So we can generate 3-meter Landsat image, so that can also isolate the tower footprint of this historical flux tower data set. So that could be one option to revisit of the old historical tower data sets. So second is temporal scaling. So 10 years ago, so that is one of the, at the time, the Youngryel synthesis paper. It was on the temporal scaling of evaporation from the instantaneous remote sensing to 8-day mean daily sums. So in these old days, because satellite revisit frequency was quite sparse, so what we did is just measure a snapshot in the morning or afternoon and apply such cosine function to get the daily sum estimate of carbon flux or water flux. But we know that that is valid if there is diurnal symmetry of the fluxes, but it is not. Sometimes it doesn't happen. So now the geostationary satellite that is also quite abundant. So that is one example of the GK2A. It is a Korean satellite, and also there is Himawari from JAXA, and also GOES from the United States. And there are several geostationary satellites across the world, and they scan every like 5 minutes for the fixed Earth disk. So here again, so we apply the NIVP from the GK2A, the satellite, and here y-axis is from the flux tower GPP. For the 5 flux towers, that is hourly and that is daily. So in this way, we don't need cosine-based temporal upscaling. Just scan every 10 minutes and just aggregate to the daily sum, and it worked pretty well. So it is from the Songchan's work, the PhD student. But the one caveat is that that is example. Here, the South Korea is located around here, the Seoul. So as you can see, it is off nadar. So it is around 37 degrees to north. And also there's very large variation of the solar zenith angle. So the view angle variation is very, very strong. So we have to remove all these atmospheric corrections and BRDF effects. So that is example. So here, so we compare the one is when we use the TOA reflectors, so top of the atmosphere, or the surface reflectors after atmospheric correction, and the normalized reflectors. Then normalized reflectors means that a sort of the M-bar, so, normalizing the solar angle and also sensor view angle. So by using the normalized reflectance, we can see the relationship between NIVP and GPP across the hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. It performed better compared to the others. Also, the slope was very consistent. Once we correct the BRDF effect and atmospheric correction both, then you can see that is the case of this color. So so yeah, the geo satellite is very useful, but one has to apply the atmospheric correction and also BRDF correction properly. And recently, the Sing Lee, he's a research professor in my group, so he used the GOES satellite data set to detect, and he found that the GOES can detect the midday depression in the dryland photosynthesis in the Midwestern United States. That is the temperature anomaly, and that is a diurnal centroid change. So you can see because of the 2020 very strong heat wave, the peak time of photosynthesis it moved to the morning. So in such case, we can apply the cosine function for the temporal scaling. So you can see many regions show this red colors. That means that the peak timing was advanced towards the morning time. And what he did is that he used the upscaling from the single snapshot or just aggregate the GOES observations and estimate the daily sum. And we can find that the difference could be, yeah, that is the case of GOES. But if we just upscale from the single snapshot to the daily sum using the 8 a.m. data or 9, for example, 10 could be modest Terra and 12, 2 p.m. could be modest Aqua. So yeah, just now it is time to use just scan every time and just aggregate to get the daily sum rather than using one snapshot and apply the cosine function. And so the third is spectral upscaling. So yeah, as you know, now the MMAP is already in the orbit, and I found the carbon mapper. It is very promising. It'll be hyperspectral constellations by the planet and also the JPL. And the FLEX mission will be launched pretty soon. So the hyperspectral remote sensing is also getting more and more abundant in the space. And So here, so one we did in the past is, I think Jongmin seems here. So he was my former PhD student. We developed the inside hyperspectral sensors. It is homemade sensor, so we like so homemade. So here, so we use three very narrowband pass filter, and here 760 that is O2A band, and there are two band in the shoulder, and then so we develop a sensor and just rotate the whole system to measure incoming, outgoing. And what we found is that is a reference, that is a QPro, and that is the forest that we developed. And here the red is before DCMU treatment. DCMU just break the electron transport change. So once DCMU was treated, then usually the SIF increased. So here is the case from the reference sensor of the QPro, and that is the sensor from our homemade sensor. And that is comparison between our sensor and the SIF from the QPro. So it worked pretty well. So yeah, first we try to make the hyperspectral sensors in the lab. And then the other thing that we have to consider is the view geometry. So first is, I think most of the people in the FluxNet community, they use this method, just measure incoming irradiance and outgoing the radiance from the certain direction with the very narrow band view angle. And that is good to evaluate the satellite reflectance, because that is quite similar with what satellite sees from the space. But once we want to connect with the lens surface fluxes, I think that is more valid, because it achieved the photon balance. So how much photon is come and how much goes out. And so that is our lead observation. So there has been such two approaches to measure. So for example, Dennis site use this approach. Then why not measuring both? That is my PhD student Chong has been working on. So we developed such instrument. So here, so we measure the incoming irradiance, but we at the same time using the prism, we measure outgoing radiance. That is outgoing radiance, and that is outgoing irradiance. So this is BRF, bidirectional reflectance vector, and that is the observations of the albedo. And so in the box there is HR2000 and QPro. So in this band we focus on the SIF, that is QPro, and for the veneer band, that spectrum is for just broad applications. So yeah, so we measure both. And that is one example from the rice paddy. So as you can see here, that is wavelengths and that is day over year. You can see how the spectral reflectance shows the seasonal variations, dancing of the spectrum. But one important thing is that here is bidirectional reflectance vector, and that is bihemispherical reflectance. So that is albedo. You can see the magnitude and pattern is quite different. So the physical quantity of these two variables are different. So by measuring both variables, I think Jongho is now working on the retrieving of the BRDF parameters by measuring both. And that is the case of rice paddy. And also we have been collecting this long-term hyperspectral data set. That is one example from the Tehwa Mountain, that is Abilene Needle Forest. So here the data set is 2018, 19, 20, and 21. And you can see here that is day over year. Here is wavelengths, and the color is the reflectance. And one interesting thing is that here the red band in the near infrared channel, sometimes there is the increase of the reflectance that is related with the diffuse radiation from the cloud conditions. Then reflectance increase. So such long-term records of the hyperspectral data set will be very, very useful to evaluate, to understand what is happening in your site and the linking with your flux tower data set. And one example is that by from postdoc Ben Zhang, he did very nice work. So at the time, because we have the hyperspectral data set over the whole season in the rice paddy, so we split the hyperspectral data sets between this band is a Zandberg cycle where the PRI happens, and also we use the SIF band. So we split the spectral band, and we tested how much we can predict the GPP. And once we use the reflectance, of course, as expected, using whole or just sieve seems fine. But once we use availing irradiance, outgoing radiance, then we found that just measuring the near-infrared, the black, is already pretty good and even better than sieve and APAR. Actually, that is the motivation of the using of NIVP. The background idea is from here. So I think the observations of the hyperspectral is great, but sometimes the broadband could be also good enough. But such a lesson can be learned once we measure hyperspectral data sets. And now we have the expanding such hyperspectral systems across the flux towers in the Korean Peninsula and several flux forests, and recently we installed in the wetland and several flux towers in the rice paddy and forest. And that is one case. Also, we have the drone image for each site. You can see the different forests have different structures. And I think one very interesting finding is that is the spectral reflectance in the day of year 223. So it's a peak growing season. And that is, the 3 sites have similar LAI around 4 to 5. But you can see that in the near-infrared, reflectance is very different from the needle leaf. We believe that is related with the shoot structure, because once photon is captured, it is just it cannot escape. So photon is just trapped within the shoot. So you can see the infrared reflectance is very different. So such thing is very useful to link with your optical observations with the flux. And the integration, I will go very quick. So that is just one example of the BEST. So we developed the BEST in 2011 in this original version. And 2016, Chongya developed the next version. And just recently, last week, we just published BEST version 2. So the key update is that now we have added ecosystem restoration. And also we use the VSNAPs from the optimality principle, not lookup table. And also we use the whole ABHRR and modest period. So we we generated the 40 years of the record. And because it is coupled model, we can see now the global pictures. So how much solar radiation is coming, and shortwave, PAR, and APAR. And also we measure net radiation, latent efflux, and all the carbon components. So the key strength is that we can see the functional relationship, for example, Bodico curve, or water use efficiency, or carbon use efficiency. So I think that is the benefit by having the coupled process model. And we tested across the FluxNet dataset, and that is global trends. But I think still I have to confess that the carbon sink is too strong, so it's around -20. And when I visit the FluxNet workshop 2 weeks ago in the Bruno, I found that Fluxcom X, they generate the next version of the Fluxcom. Their global NEE is now around -6 petameter carbon. It is more realistic. So I think, so that could be best version 3. So we will have to work harder. And so that is the global maps of coupled fluxes. The outlook. So I think it's very exciting. So that is one example of the CubeSat. So there is one Korean company. So we are working together. So that is one example of the case of the 96 constellations of the CubeSat. So in the case, if we have some target, we can scan every 10 minutes. So if you think about some crop fields, and then we can monitor the crop fields every 10 minutes from the space. So that is quite the new generations of how to monitor the ecosystem fluxes. And also the geostationary satellite, there is NASA Ames. They are making a great effort to make the geo constellations. So just make the constellations of the geo satellites to measure every 10 minutes of the whole the Earth. So that is the next generations of the data set. So that is the quick conclusions. So I think constellations in hyperspectral, geostationary, and polar orbit satellites, they are now emerging. And also it is time for the FLUX community to explore all this information towards everywhere, all of the time. And I recommend attaching hyperspectral sensor in your towers. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Youngryel. We'll take Q&A after this second presentation. Next up is Kanishka Mallick. Yep. Do you have any comments, Youngryel? No. Okay. Yeah. Next up is Kanishka Mallick. Kanishka, if you're ready. I think Youngryel, you can stop sharing screen.
Yeah, I'm trying. And somehow the button does not appear.
I can do it from here as well. If I start sharing, it will automatically stop sharing with Youngryel. So I can do that from here.
Oh, I
Okay.
think I stopped.
Great. Okay, looking good. Okay, I see a full screen, Kanishka.
I'm just trying to minimize the Zoom part. Okay, good. So good afternoon to everyone. It's indeed a very unusual time, and Youngryel gave a fantastic, a broad overall picture of the ecosystem science, and it's always a challenge to speak after Youngryel gives his talk because of kind of excellent work that he is doing. So I'm going to go with a bit of a vertical detail on how can we use the information of photosynthetically active radiation in assessing vegetation index, NIRV, and productivity variability across different ecosystems and climatic gradients, which I mean, and a part of bigger picture that Youngryel showed, and this is more about how this kind of information can be used to validate vegetation index from the operational satellite products, and yet is developing upscale relationship for predicting a GPP, which is one of the biggest research objective in the flux net. So the motivation of this study is generated by when we started questioning about what is the contribution of vegetation seasonality and what is the interaction of vegetation with environment and how it affects the ecosystem processes and functioning. The obvious smart answer might arrive that we have many operational NDVI products, for example, from MODIS, from VIIRS, and it's already generating time continuous NDVI at 250 meter spatial resolution every on a 16-day basis. And on the top of that, we also have discrete time series NDVI from sensors like Landsat and Sentinel. But one of the biggest challenges is the footprint mismatch when it comes to MODIS or VIIRS kind of sensor. And when it comes to Landsat or Sentinel, it is always a discrete time series. So there it always have a problem of, or let's say challenge of sampling frequency. And in addition to that, cloud contamination very often stops us in getting the time series values. And on the other side, there are in situ sensor and status. We have Decagon and Apogee sensors, which are available since 2015, and some or many of these AmeriFlux and FluxNet sites might be having these sensors at the Flux Tower. But recently what we got to know that Decagon is out of production and these sensors are having some kind of challenge with respect to the stability. So as a result, so we started questioning ourselves that how can we observe temporally dense description of vegetation conditions at the eyes and ears of the Flux Tower sites accurately, inexpensively, and over the entire data record over which these flux sites are operating. So this graph is a kind of thing that kind of dream record that we would like to generate for ourselves. And this is just for 4 years, but the question is, can we use photosynthetically active radiation to do this for 20 or 25 years over those flux tower sites that they're generating? So the next question arrives is, why do we see this unique spectral signature of vegetation? The obvious question is, it is because of photosynthesis. We can take any green vegetation, whether it's of long grass or from forest or maple leaves, we always see a kind of dynamic spectra. And without the presence of photosynthesis, we will just end up getting monotonous spectra that we find in over rocks and water. So basically what is the point is, without photosynthesis, we cannot expect this dynamic vegetation spectra, because this is, since our school life, we know the story that plants utilize PAR, and of course, more we got into the ecosystem science, so we realized that of course the presence of water is very critical. That leads to the photosynthetic carbon exchange and biomass accumulation, ecosystem productivity, and finally, as the plant grows, so we started seeing this dynamic spectral reflectance both in vegetation and near infrared zone. So therefore, ideally, from the measurements of PAR, we should be able to obtain some information of vegetation index, which we cannot say exactly NDVI, but it is usable enough or utilizable enough to compare with NDVI, and it should be able to explain some percentage of variability of satellite NDVI. So here is the theory and hypothesis. Basically, I would like to ask you to see in the left-hand side. So these two are the spectral signature of one. The upper one is for the lawn grass, and the lower one is for the dry grass and desert. So basically, we can divide this entire electromagnetic spectrum here into visible, near infrared, and MIR from 0.4 to 3 micrometer. And this is the remote sensing, and where we use the directional part that sensors are seeing from one direction, and through correction of BRDF, we are getting the directional reflectance. But on the other side, these eddy covariance flux tower sites, they are simultaneously measuring shortwave radiation, which we also call global radiation, both the incident and reflected component between 0.3 to 3 micrometer, which is a broadband. And on the other side, we also have the line quantum sensor, which is measuring PAR between 0.4 to 0.7 micrometer, and which is a kind of proximal sensing. And this is definitely not a directional reflectance, but this can give us the proximal sensing and the hemispherically integrated signal. Now the question is, can we do a smart method and usable method by using the balance of these two different radiation quantities, PAR and shortwave radiation, and we can dig out the information of visible portion and near infrared portion of reflectance, and which is not exactly equal to the narrowband red and NIR, but it is very much approximately equal to red and NIR narrowband reflectance. So as a result, we should be able to derive a broadband vegetation index, and which is very much equal to what we call NDVI. So using some spectral transformation and using the reflected and incident component of this PAR and shortwave, we should be able to derive, or we derive this broadband vegetation index and broadband NIRV. And this methodology, it's not the first time that that is being proposed. It was first done by Fred Humrich in 1997, and later on some other people, but I just used it and then applied over a large range of data sets. And here, in order to test the methodology, that whether it can be comparable with NDVI across different scales, so what we have done is we have used two different satellite measurements here, and they vary in two different scales, which is the planet fusion datasets that is available at 3 meter spatial resolution. And plus we have also used the harmonized Landsat and Sentinel-2, which is available at 30 meter spatial resolution. And we have the measurements of PAR from eddy covariance, plus in addition to that, we had measurements of GPP, surface energy balance fluxes, and rainfall, because we wanted to check that how this method is performing across energy limited and radiation limited ecosystems. So from 30 minutes temporal resolution eddy covariance, we have extracted the data for 10 to 12 noon and made an average as a daily representative, because this is the time exactly when the polar orbiting satellites are having their overpass time. So the planet fusion datasets are available for continuous time series of 4 years, and Landsat and Sentinel-2 are available from 2014 to 2021 as a discrete time series. So in totality, when we distilled the dataset, with the planet, we had approximately 5,000 daily datasets. And with the Landsat and Sentinel-2, we had more than 10,000, but of course it is discrete. So apparently that the size of the data sets are reduced. And the sites were total 25. Among them, there were 7 Ameriflux Biomet sites, which is operated by our UC Berkeley Biomet Lab. There were 4 additional Ameriflux sites, and on the top of that, we had neon sites where also the PAR components were available continuously from 2016 or 2017 onwards. So with all these things, so the obvious questions we thought of asking ourselves that 4 questions mainly, that can a broadband vegetation index retrieved from PAR measurements is able to explain NDVI, NIRV, and GPP variability across ecoclimatic gradients? And if so, how is the seasonal variability get captured when we compare it with respect to the satellite NDVI and NIRV? And if there is a similarity, or if there is a difference between these 2 indices, then what are the factors that is affecting the differences? And finally, if we derive such an index from the flux tower sites, is it able to explain the variability of tower observed GPP? So this is the first set of examples that when we compared with planet fusion dataset at 3-meter spatial resolution over alpha and corn, as you can see that the the figure in the upper right hand side, it can explain or it can capture the seasonal variation both in corn and the most interesting part was in alfalfa there are multiple growing cycles because it's a very short-term crop, and each and every time it could be able to capture the temporal variation. And in the lower left side, we can clearly see that both VI and NIRV, they are able to explain 93% of the observed variability in narrowband NIRV and NDVI. But of course, what we found out is the systematic RMSD is surprisingly high in NIRV, and there was a saturation or asymptotic pattern, particularly in the NIRV signal when satellite NIRV were exceeding 0.3, and these are the colors which are the zone of very high biomass. So that means we have found out a saturation in our retrieval when GPP was very high, and those are the points were associated with high biomass. And here you can see that, especially in alfalfa, these are the different times of the years, especially in the summer season, June, July, August, September, there is frequent cutting and growing of alfalfa. But on the other side, corn has a very distinct growing cycle. So for these two very different conditions of C3 and C4 plants, the index is able to capture the needed variability that we had been looking for. Next is the wetland side. We found exactly the similar pattern as we saw in agriculture. Same vegetation index is able to explain 85% of the observed NDVI variability of planet fusion. But with respect to NIRV, first of all, the range was very limited. And again, there were some saturation of NIRV with increasing biomass. And of course, it was able to explain only 68% of the observed variability in NIRV, and with, again, consistently high RMSD of 73%. And next question was, how did it perform in savanna and grassland? Of course, the temporal dynamics very nicely captured the observed temporal dynamics of NDVI. And the most interesting part is here we did not see any such saturation that we found in NIRV, because there was here, this is the kind of savanna and grassland ecosystem, they are not producing that kind of heavy biomass. So as a result, here it is able to explain both the NIRV and NDVI variability within 68 to 70% range, and without any kind of sign of those kind of saturation. So overall, when we combine the data of all these 7 sites of our biomet lab, so we found that our broadband vegetation index is able to capture 50 to 92% of the observed variation in NDVI, and the overall with an average correlation of 87% and systematic RMSD of 33%. And on the other side, NIRV, despite it has a very high correlation, but the saturation was obvious, and this high saturation was mainly for the high biomass region, and which is also coinciding with high GPP. So now the next question is obviously that how does it compare with LAI, because we know that NDVI and LAI, they're intrinsically related. And again, thanks to Youngryel's PhD, that since those days, the upward-looking digital camera is operating in Tonzi Ranch. So we were fortunate enough to get the time continuous data sets coincident to the planet data. And when we plotted LAI and vegetation index, and we could clearly see that there is a very strong correlation, and LAI is explaining 82% of the variation of vegetation index during the growing season. And these are the colors which are color-coded by gap fraction. And we have found out that during this growing season, the gap fraction was 0.4 to 0.6 or 40 to 60% of the gap fraction. And this coincided with the day of the year, which was mainly between the active growing season 130 to 280 calendar day, where canopy gap fraction varied between 0.4 to 0.6. And this is the figure that you can see in the inset of this figure. However, we have also observed that there is a large divergence between LAI and NDVI when the gap fraction exceeded 65%, and which is mainly coincided with when the day of the year exceeded 290 until the warm spring arrived. The warm spring, and these are you can see that the points in the within red rectangular places, these are the time when winter is approaching until the warm spring, and where gap fraction is more than 65%, and these are the data points but there is a large divergence between LAI and vegetation index. But however, it gives us the needed confidence that the vegetation index is also capturing the needed variation of leaf area index. And the next question is, how is the seasonal response of this vegetation index with respect to soil water content? Here, this is the mean seasonal variation by combining data of all the 4 years for C3, C4, alpha, which is represented by alfalfa and corn, and plus UD7 and grassland. So here I would like to explain 3 important things here. First, if you see in the cropland sites, it's very obvious that there is a very nice coordination in vegetation index in the cropland. And same nice coordination you also found in UD7 and grassland. But the most important part is in UD7 and grassland, there is a remarkably high coordination with soil moisture variability, and there was no coordination with soil moisture variability in the croplands. And another thing what we found is that these are the red dots. This is the line of the mean, and what we found is the highest vegetation index were observed under the wettest condition, and these are the conditions where the mean soil moisture was much above 1. So that means when the mean soil moisture was much above the entire annual mean. And then we found that as the soil moisture started decreasing from 150 calendar day of the year until 250 or 270, it kept on decreasing, of course, because in this kind of ecosystems, the vegetation biomass and the GPP variability is very much coincided or described by the soil moisture variation. So as a result, with decreasing soil moisture, that means these are the cases where vapor pressure deficit of the atmosphere also decreases, and that puts a lot of challenges for the plant stomata. And as a result, there is a strong limitation on GPP, and here the vegetation index is also decreasing with decreasing soil moisture. And this is the intraseasonal variation, and here we segregated the data according to the spring and summer. So between for these, we segregated the data between March to October and 3 months each. And here, 2 things we found out during the growing season. There is a strong coupling between the coefficient of variation of both between our vegetation index and NIRV with coefficient of variation of precipitation, and that is also coinciding with the coefficient of variation of gross photosynthesis. And this is we found for both satellite and our broadband vegetation index. And another thing that we have found out is that more the rainfall variability, more is the slope getting steeper when you plotted VI and NIRV with the photosynthesis. And this sensitivity is much higher in grassland and woody savanna as compared to in the cropland and the wetland. Now the next question is what are the controlling factors that is determining the differences between the broadband and narrowband. So the first 2 rows we plotted for agriculture here, and the first figure is for the visible reflectance and the second figure is for the NIR reflectance. So here 3 distinct things we have found out, that there is a consistent overestimation of our broadband reflectance with respect to the red reflectance, and the differences were magnified with increasing water stress. Here, as a factor of water stress, we took evaporative fraction from the eddy covariance towers, and you can see that as the water stress is increasing, first of all, there was of course a consistent underestimation, and as the evaporative fraction is increasing, so the underestimation tendency was even higher. And on the other side, there was no effects of water limitation when we compared the NIR reflectance with the satellite NIR reflectance. So as a result, and exactly the similar thing we found in the grassland. So what does it mean? So that means in our vegetation index estimation, there is a large overestimation of the numerator as compared to what we see from the satellite with increasing water stress, and that is leading to the diminishing agreement between our own broadband vegetation index and NDVI as the water stress is kicking in. And we also found exactly the similar pattern when we plotted for this wetland and for the large spectrum of energy and water limited ecosystem. And this also gave us the answer that why we found the saturation of NIRV, because here you can see that from the previous slides, that with increasing the satellite NIR reflectance, our broadband NIR reflectance is also showing the saturation. So that means more and more we are going into the high biomass region, our broadband vegetation index is getting saturated. And as a result, we are getting this kind of asymptotic limit when we are comparing the NIR, our NIRV with the satellite NIRV. So now this is the last question we wanted to answer, that whether our broadband vegetation index compare well with when we plotted with the tower observed GPP. So here I used two approaches. One is just plotting with first vegetation index and then plotting with NIRVP, as Youngryel mentioned. And one, of course, shows a nonlinearity and NIRVP. And what is the most important thing that we found out is it is able to explain the variability for the entire range of energy to water limited condition, entire range of water stressed, water unstressed condition. The most important thing that I found out that NIRVP, what it does is it does a nonlinear stretching of NDVI, and as a result of this nonlinear stretching, all the literatures have shown that a far distinct linearity when we plot GPP with NIRVP as compared to when we plot just only with vegetation index. And this I would like to go very quickly. So we found exactly the similar pattern with Landsat and Sentinel-2, and this is the result of radiation limited environment. The upper row is for the Landsat 8 and lower row is for the Sentinel-2, and here you can see exactly the same pattern, that it can capture the seasonal variation, but of course with increasing biomass, there is a distinct saturation of signal from NIRV when we compare with both Sentinel-2 NIRV and Landsat 8 NIRV. But another interesting feature that we have found out is when we are comparing it in the water limited ecosystem, so we are getting relatively better result overall, despite the saturation happens and despite we have higher errors, because we are getting a large variability in vegetation index when we are going in the water limited ecosystem as compared to in the radiation limited ecosystem. So what we learned from this study is, this study said that from the proximal sensing measurement or the hemispherically integrated measurements, we are able to derive a robust vegetation index that is capable of explaining the LAI variability. It is at the appropriate scale. It is at the eyes and ears of the decovariance tower. It does not need any radiative transfer, and it does not need any spectrometer measurement. And we are able to monitor the seasonal and interannual variability directly at the decovariance footprint. Plus, it can be relevant to compare the operational vegetation index from the future Earth observation mission. Of course, there are differential sensitivity of broad visible and near infrared reflectances to water stress and biomass accumulation due to signal saturation, due to being different methods of retrieval, for example, hemispherical versus directional. And we submitted this paper in remote sensing of environment. Yesterday, we got back the review comments. I can say I'm very happy to see the positive comment, but of course we need to address that how the soil background is affecting and how the sensor view angle effect is affecting the results. So this is where I would like to stop. But before that, I would like to do some shameless advertising, because I came to Berkeley to work on my ET partitioning. And of course, when I was using Shuttleworth-Wallace framework to do evaporation partitioning over oak savanna and corn, and started getting very interesting results. And that was the time when Dennis asked me that how are you going to explain the effect of interannual variation of vegetation index on this class partitioning? So I had to put this work in my garage and park it, and then I had to do I did all these spectral work and PAR and vegetation index, and that's a great learning curve for me. And yeah, so this is where I would like to thank you, and I would like to stop, and maybe this is the time that we start taking questions and discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanishka. Yeah, it was a great talk. Yeah, so I think it's time for us to take Q&A and discussion. So if you have any, I see Wu Son. So he's clapping, but yeah, if you have any questions to speakers, yeah, please, yeah, you can unmute your mic and speak up, or you can also type in the chat. And in the meantime, yeah, waiting for question from others. I have a question for both of you, and seems to be a kind of grand question, to be honest, but both of you are kind of working on developing kind of novel approaches to make measurement at the footprint matching eddy covariance. So Kanishka just explained using those radiance reflectance measurement that's already available at many eddy covariance sites. And also Youngryel, yeah, you and your group is working on come up with like homebrew homemade measurement that can kind of for a SIF measurement, which can complement flux tower measurement as well, and also in an affordable way. So to make it, so my question is, I think they are all related to upscaling questions. And what do you think is the most challenging part of most challenges for upscaling these days? There are so many data available already. And what do you think is the next step for us maximize utilization of those existing approaches?
Kanishka first.
Youngryel, you can go first.
Okay, for the SIP sensor, I think Dongmin is here, so he developed. And so our original intention was to make the inexpensive SIP sensor, because it is usually very expensive, like flux system or even homemade system, the Cube Pro and the fiber optics and all the together, it is quite expensive. So we decided to develop very inexpensive system to measure SIP. But it took almost 4 to 5 years to develop, and it turns out that it is not that cheap. So in the end, we found that all the labor costs and our calibrations, and yeah, so but at least we found that the filter-based the system can detect the SIP. That is what we confirmed. But I think so one of the original intention is for the upscaling, because it's sort of those inexpensive sensors in many sizes, and so we can see the heterogeneity of the lens surface fluxes. But to do so, I think sometimes I think some companies should invest some money and also to customize and lower the cost. And in the case, it could be more widely adapted. But at this stage, it is just homemade, and yeah, we confirmed it worked.
So it seems like your answer is more making more widely available by lowering the cost of those measurements. That's one step forward to improve our upscaling, I guess.
Yeah, but and as we have the SIF system in our the hyperspectral system, so using the Cube Pro, so the default system is there, but I think still we need to make some efforts to lower the cost.
Kanishka, you have any comments or your answer?
I think from my experience, what I realized is this in the flux tower, these different kind of radiation instruments, they're really robust, more stable. So I must say that these can be a great source of information by which you can generate, or we should be more concentrating on the theory. How can you best use the theory to generate these kind of vegetation attributes? And then, of course, they cannot be exactly the way satellite sensor or satellite retrievals are working, but then how close we can do, and what kind of variability we can capture. But of course, you and me, we already know, and as also Youngryel shown, that in this kind of signals do not work so well with the evergreen needle-leaf forest because they do not dissipate that energy, they trap the energy. And you and me, we also saw that from other sites. So in my analysis, I didn't involve any evergreen needle-leaf forest, but other than that, at least for agriculture, grassland, savanna sites, I mean, this kind of methodology work ideally with good level of, I would say, more stable approach, I would say. But someone also questioned that what are the major uncertainties in scaling RNIRV to GPP remote sensing?
Yeah, if any of you have some answers to Yumi.
I mean, I can try, but of course, my background is mostly on evaporation and thermal remote sensing. But over the last 1 year, I have been studying and doing it. So basically, as we say that depending on how different vegetation type they capture the energy and they reflect. So when we plot a robust, try to plot a robust relationship between this NIRVP and GPP, we always see a kind of large scatter. And Youngryel's work already has shown that there are different colors. I have also seen exactly the similar kind of thing. But now the question is that how can we reduce this uncertainty? I mean, this is of course an uncertainty that different kind of vegetation, they are having different kind of reflectance depending on how much energy they are carrying or they are dissipating. So this is one of the most important part. So now the question is, do we want to develop a model for or know like an universal function, like a universal function for the globe, or we want to segregate according to different ecosystems or biome types? I think this is one of the kind of question or uncertainty. But maybe Youngryel, you can say more about it.
Yeah, so I think the key uncertainty is likely the physiology, because NIV itself is mostly explained related with the canopy structure. So yeah, recently one of my postdoc, Liang Wang, he just multiplied the canopy chlorophyll contents to NIRV, and it explained the. So in many cases, GP versus NIRVP, there is some saturation, particularly in the crop sites. But by considering the chlorophyll content, we found it is fairly linear. So I think still NIV is lacking the information of the some physiological information. I think that is likely the key uncertainty now. And also I found that Uson has the comment about the site level upscaling. Yeah, so I know it is very hard. So actually we have invested a lot of efforts to upscale for several frost tower sites. I think there is no easy way. you have to invest. So I think what we did is that all the sites we have of course in the frost tower there is a hyperspectral system, but their view angle does not match with the tower footprint. So we regularly have the hyperspectral drone in each site. So we make the spatial patterns of the hyperspectral images, and also we do regular observations of the terrestrial laser scanner, and also the drone-based the LiDAR. So yeah, so try to fill the gaps in space and time and spectrum to link with the satellite. It requires a lot of the different levels of works, but yeah, drone. Yeah, so you really need the drone, I think.
And I just would like to add one thing. I mean, many years before, I used to think that there can be a model for everywhere, whether it's called GPP or evaporation. But apparently, over the time, it's very difficult to have it. I mean, because different ecosystems, they function in a different way. They have different physiological activities. And then the most important part is how close we understand those differences and how we can mitigate that kind of gap. Otherwise, it's and yeah. So this is what my own realization.
Great. And one thing I want to add, I'm not a speaker, but I attended kind of a workshop that was for proximal remote sensors who are doing research at site level using remote sensing techniques. And what they discuss is that something that can do that can help upscaling from ground-based to satellite-based is something they do with the ground-based remote sensing techniques. And there are a lot of techniques, different approaches utilizing thermal, hyperspectral, and solar-induced fluorescence. There are many, and there are many companies developing those instruments right now. And scientists are working on working with their own approaches, but there are no standardized way to make measurement and how to incorporate all the data from different sites. Something like Ameriflux or FluxNet do, like incorporating all the data. So there might be also some efforts we need. So integration of data and standardizing method of ground-based remote sensing data seems to be also a critical aspect to improve our upscaling. That's my 2 cents.
I fully agree. Yeah, so even my site, I have several sites. Even myself, it was really hard to standardize. Each site has all the differences, so really hard.
And especially those domains or those kind of signals where your chances of having pure signal is very limited, very uncertain. You know that there could be a lot of noise. So even working with those data sets are even more harder, right? I mean, I do not operate any site, but from different literatures and that kind of thing, I mean, Youngryel, you are doing really excellent and very deep research on these things. So say, for example, and this is what I got excited about this, using different radiation measurements, because the signals are stable, robust, useful, and then you can get something out of it as compared to just measuring something in a very narrow spectral band where there is higher kind of noise, or the possibility of noise could be much higher, I would say. And when it comes to a sophisticated measurement like SIF, that is, the challenge is even more, I believe.
Yep.
And any other questions? Okay, then I think it's 5:05. So yeah, I think it's time to wrap up. So yeah, thank you everyone. And yeah, thank you Youngryel and Kanishka for the awesome talks, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And today's session is recorded and will be uploaded to the Ameriflux YouTube channel in the coming days. And we'll come back with another webinar next month. So yeah, until then, take care and see you next time then. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.